All she could remember was hearing her father's voice of hope for a better outcome as she and her sister were taken away. She never even got to say goodbye, and it would be the last time that she and her sister would ever see their father again. For in that moment, their family was lost forever. This was a dark and grievous time for her and her sister as they endured this war. And as you would imagine, the entire experience left them with negative emotional and social and physical scars. This scenario sounds familiar to events that happen all too often in high conflict custody cases where there's alienation. But this was not a high conflict custody divorce case. This was World War II, and the children were in custody of the Nazi Gestapo. The young sisters watched as her oldest sister was beaten and eventually starved to death. And then she nearly died herself. And yet years later, when presented with the opportunity to forgive or exact revenge on a former guard of the concentration camp where she and her sister were held, she chose to forgive. And then she famously stated, "Forgiveness is an act of will, and the will can function regardless of the temperature of the heart." These are the words of Corrie ten Boom. Often when one thinks about forgiveness, the thought is of having to absolve the other person of the wrong that they have committed. But this is not true. Forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves. It is the gift of freedom. But it is also not easy. An important point to remember is that your choice to forgive or not does not erase the hurt and pain caused by the other person's actions. But the choice to forgive does open the door to your emotional freedom. Few, if any, can forget the pain they've suffered or continue to suffer. Maybe it's not so much about trying to figure out how to forget the pain or even the events that led to the pain. Or perhaps it should be about the way you remember, and the way you remember not because you want to exact revenge, but because what happened is part of your life. And you are a product of how you respond to your life experiences. Therefore, the only question is, how do you want your life? How do you want to live? Do you want to be enslaved to pain by unforgiveness, or set free with the inner peace that forgiveness brings? Hello, I'm Dr. Colleen Murray. And before I get started, I wanted to make sure everyone had some paper and something to write with, because you're going to want to take notes. And while you're up getting those things together, I want to thank Elaine for inviting me to come and talk to you, and for the effort that she puts forth into coordinating all of the free webinar trainings. You can see all the webinars and register for the upcoming events by going to www.familyaccessfightingforchildren'srights.com. To help keep all this training free of charge, please share the information regarding upcoming webinar training sessions, the television program, and our upcoming conference with other parents and grandparents or mental health and legal professionals. I also wanted to take a minute to share with you what I think will be an exciting event happening this September. Family Access Fighting for Children's Rights, in conjunction with Steel Partners Foundation, is hosting a live in-person 3-day conference September 9th through the 11th in Durham, North Carolina. This event for alienated parents, grandparents, and other family members that need support, as well as legal and mental health professionals. The theme of this conference is using and refining interpersonal skills. And I'm not sure what I'm more excited about, being in my favorite state of North Carolina or seeing everyone in person after 2 years of forced isolation. Elaine has put together quite a lineup for you. Dr. Jeffrey Gardere will be there as our keynote speaker. We will also have presentations by the leading experts in the field of alienation. Bill Eddy, Megan Hunter from the High Conflict Institute, Attorney Shazi Spachman, Dr. Joshua Coleman, Dr. Sue Kornbluth, Dr. Mark Mosk, Dr. Amy Alvarez, and Ms. Lisa Rothfuss. Also, if you haven't already registered, I want to encourage you to do so as soon as possible, as the pre-early bird special ends April 30th and space is limited. So I look forward to seeing all of you there. Okay, I hope all of you have your pen and paper or pencils. And tonight I will be talking to you about forgiveness and how spirituality helped make this a science. First, we'll walk through some steps on processing the negative emotions that can block your ability or my ability to forgive. Second, within my presentation, I will provide answers to questions that our audience submitted in advance. And then lastly, I'll wrap it up. Now, I know from working with people who have been through trauma, which includes being alienated from children, when some of you saw this title, you might have thought, forgiveness? Are you kidding me? You don't know what I've been through. And forgiveness feels like it trivializes or minimizes what's happened or what is happening to me. And you're right. I don't know what each of you have been through. You each have your own unique stories. But what I do know is trauma and the mind-body connection and how damaging trauma can be on both your mind and body. Therefore, my mission has always been to help people heal so that they can be the best versions of themselves and walk in the purpose for which they were created. So if you stay with me through this webinar, you will see this is more than a teaching. It is actually a call to action to understand what forgiveness is and is not, why it is so valuable, and how to get started on the journey of forgiveness for your own peace of mind. This is a war that is waging every day in courts, a silent and not so well-known war, but nevertheless, still with all the characteristics of a war. There's extreme violence, aggression, destruction, and or death. And in the battle over custody of children, the children have become the prisoners of wars, the POWs, if you will, trapped in the camp of an alienated parent who is engaged in warlike behavior, extreme violence, as they go to treat great or exaggerated lengths to radicalize the children from the marriage into believing that a loving and fit parent is now abusive and unfit, entering into activities of hostility, the acts of aggression against the targeted parent, giving rise to the destruction and or the death of the relationship bonds between the targeted parent and the child, and even the targeted parent's extended family. All this can leave the targeted parent deeply wounded and in pain that literally alters their life, while at the same time leaving them feeling as if no one will ever validate the egregious wrongs committed against them. As we begin this journey through forgiveness, I want to remind you of a quote from a renowned theologist, Lewis Smedes, whose work brought about the intersection of science and spirituality. He said, "It would give us some great comfort if we could only forget a past that we could not change. If we could only choose to forget the cruelest moments, we could, as time goes on, free ourselves from the pain. But the wrong sticks like a needle in our memory, and the only way to remove the needle is with the surgical precision called forgiveness." So let's talk about what forgiveness is and is not. There are two casualties in this war, the targeted parent and the children. However, for this discussion, we'll be focusing on the targeted parent and their journey. In my practice, I often see targeted parents who ruminate on the assaults made by the alienating parent. And these excessive and intrusive thoughts regarding their negative experiences result in emotional distress, which manifests as fear, anger, and resentment. And this in turn affects how they respond to the alienation, namely presenting as either a desire for vengeance or actively avoiding. Neither choice is healthy for you. But now you might be saying, okay, I get that. But what am I to do? Well, this is where you will need to be willing to forgive. Now, I can hear some of you now rolling your eyes, and you may be thinking, yeah, right. I'm still in the middle of this awful situation. It has literally turned my life into a living hell. No one appreciates what I'm going through. There is no end in sight, and you say I should forgive? How? They won't even acknowledge what they've done. Besides, if I forgive them, then that means they've won. And on top of that, it makes it seem as though what they're doing is not a big deal. And I'm sure how am I supposed to forgive what they've done? I do understand when your life has been devastated, that forgiveness feels very unrealistic. But forgiveness is not about giving in anything to them. It's about you. A wounded heart only supplies a fraction of the love it is normally able to give out. The truth is that hurting people hurt people. And forgiveness is not about asking you to set them free from the responsibility or consequences of their actions. Forgiveness is about you being willing to set yourself free by taking your power back from the alienator and by refusing to be their victim any longer. Don't give your alienator the satisfaction. Some of you may be asking, okay, but what do I do with my pain? Acknowledge it. Because although the pain you feel is very real, it has been caused by somebody else. And the good news is you get to choose how to manage the resulting feelings. You get to take your power back. You see, nobody can be in charge of feelings they don't own. And if you need the other person, in this case, the alienator, to make things right before you can move on, you are probably going to stay stuck in your pain, blocked by unforgiveness for a very long time, if not forever. So before we go any further, perhaps we should start with the most basic question of what is forgiveness? This is important because how one defines forgiveness helps one manage their expectations regarding the future meaning of the relationship. So if we are in the process of forgiving someone with whom we do not want a continued relationship, we usually define forgiveness as simply reducing or eliminating resentment and motivations towards revenge. However, some of you may be asking yourself, what if this is someone with whom I have a close working relationship or with whom I have a loved one in common? Should there be more to forgiveness than just getting rid of the negative feelings? I mean, do I have to reconcile with them? Let me answer this question by giving you some tools through these two working definitions regarding forgiveness. There are actually two types of forgiveness, bilateral and unilateral. Bilateral is the one most people think of when they are in an exchange and forgiveness. They think that forgiveness is dependent upon an apology and an expression of remorse. Whereas unilateral forgiveness is an act of generosity on the part of the individual who was offended, which in this case would be you, the targeted parent. It requires nothing in return and can be motivated simply by a desire to be set free from the pain. And it serves as a means for the targeted parent to move forward and no longer be controlled by the alienating parent. If you think about it, unilateral forgiveness really is the ultimate revenge to truly living life unaffected by the actions of the abuser who wants nothing more than to wear you down into misery. I look at this as a method of fighting back on an emotionally, morally, intellectually superior level to that of the alienator. However, I want to make this very clear, and I will reiterate this throughout the discussion. Forgiveness doesn't mean there is a requirement to forget or pardon the offense. Furthermore, reconciliation is completely different from forgiveness. And although it may be possible to reconcile with someone who's hurt you, it is not a component of forgiveness, nor is reconciliation necessary to deliver the healing effect of forgiveness in your life. In fact, you don't even have to tell the other person that you have forgiven them. It's not necessary. You see, reconciliation means the restoration of a fractured relationship by overcoming the grief. pain and anger through the development of a shared vision and mutual acknowledgement of past suffering, combined with the change of destructive attitudes and behaviors into a mutually beneficial relationship with the goal of sustaining peace. However, that is not always an emotionally or physically safe option, because in an abusive relationship, we are not focusing this discussion on the bilateral forgiveness. Rather, this discussion is focused on the concept of unilateral forgiveness, where the offended person or the targeted parent makes a principled decision to give up their justified right for vengeance in exchange for freeing themselves from the emotional trauma. Again, this is not reconciliation. You see, forgiveness is not something you give to another person. It is actually something that you give to yourself. It is the gift of freedom and release. Freedom from feeling the painful destruction of anger and its devices like bitterness, resentment, revenge, and grudge holding. Anger and its derivatives are toxic, and they come from being hurt. And when you are consumed with anger and all the accompanying negative emotions, it always hurts us more than it hurts the other person with whom we're angry. One thing I caution here: if your forgiveness is underpinned with the hope and expectation that one day the scales will fall from the alienator's eyes and they will suddenly see how terrible they've treated you, this can put your emotional freedom at risk if the other person has a personality disorder. Because a key component of a diagnosis of a personality disorder is a lack of or a diminished capacity to express empathy. This means they are unable. Not that they are choosing, but they literally lack the ability to fully understand or even share another person's experiences or emotions. Therefore, they are not motivated at all by your emotional distress because they cannot or have a very limited capacity to understand or empathize your point of view. As a side note, this does not in any way excuse their behavior. It only explains it. However, you do have empathy, and that's a good thing. But in cases where you are in a dispute with an individual with a personality disorder, it works against you, because interactions with this population are not intuitive. You see, it's your empathy that makes it difficult for you to let go of the expectations that an aggressive, alienating parent will ever have a moment of clarity and apologize. And holding out the hope that someday they will understand or stop acting within their own emotional limitations before you can be set free is a self-imposed life sentence of pain. Regardless of the circumstances, the thing to remember is that it is not the alienating parent that is holding the keys to your freedom. It's you, through the process of forgiveness. With all the research and understanding about the positive effects of freedom, it's hard to believe that at one time, not that long ago, the concept of freedom fell solely under the umbrella of religion. However, as the field of mental health continued to explore and more fully understand the mind and body connection, as the field came to realize the power and the practical therapeutic benefits that forgiveness offers to a broken and isolated world, they came to understand its importance. See, no one gets through life without getting hurt. We all have experienced the pain of betrayal, violation of one's personal boundaries, words carelessly spoken, or purposely misspoken through gossip or lies. As a process, forgiveness focuses on the fundamental question of life in general: what to do with one's life experiences, but more specifically, with regard to this discussion, how do we deal with the transgressions and offenses that others commit against us? It is the how that touches our mental health and our well-being. So what do we do with the pain? acknowledge it, ignore it, or perhaps hold on to it. The process of forgiving revolves around observing the personal experiences of our own and other people's lives and what that teaches us about forgiveness. When we think of the science behind the processes associated with mental health therapy, the processes are like science, observable and the outcomes reproducible. By contrast, for many, the process of forgiveness may seem mysterious and lack tangible or concrete steps. But is the science of mental health strategy really any more clear than the process of forgiveness? This may be hard to believe, but as late as the 1980s, virtually no one had studied forgiveness. In fact, social theorists and social scientists basically ignored forgiveness, not even warranting it to a footnote in the over 300 years since the Age of Enlightenment, because forgiveness was seen as strictly a religious concept. Therefore, up until that time, everything we knew about forgiveness came from the reported observations of religious leaders. And they were reporting that they had witnessed powerful healing benefits from giving and receiving forgiveness. However, how forgiving transformed lives as hope replaced guilt, anger, loneliness, and fear, as relationships were restored and the love of God transformed the lives of those in their congregations to better relational healthy bonds horizontally, person to person, as well as vertically, person to God. However, because those in the scientific community were uneasy with the idea of introducing religion into their work, scientific research in this area was stunted. Yet, the therapeutic community recognized that they needed to address the fact that a large percentage of an individual's faith forms the core of their value system, bringing meaning to both their healing and suffering. And that propelled forgiveness into a science. And interestingly enough, the individual who influenced the therapeutic community to begin scientifically studying forgiveness in the 1980s was neither a clinician nor a scientist, but rather the theologian Lewis Smedes, who I mentioned earlier. Smedes had written a book called Forgive and Forget, Healing the Hurts We Don't Deserve. The book offered stories of people's lived experiences and communicated the concept that forgiveness can be beneficial to a person's mental health and well-being. This concept really resonated and intrigued the therapeutic community. Up until that time, when most people thought about forgiveness, they associated it with religion, even if they themselves were not religious. But after Smedes' publication, there was a movement within the mental health community to investigate the concept that forgiveness was beneficial to an individual's mental health and to develop therapeutic interventions to promote forgiveness in the healing of anger, hopelessness, depression, and trauma. Couple and family therapy sessions became natural laboratories for observing the harm of unforgiveness and the healing benefits of forgiveness. This freed forgiveness from the confines of being merely an extrinsic religious concept to being considered an intrinsic motivated act. And since that time, the literature regarding forgiveness has grown dramatically, especially in the exploration of interventions designed to help us learn that giving up the right to demand that the one who hurt us pay you back or be made to suffer for what they've done is less important than healing the hurt and taking back your freedom from unforgiveness on both a psychological and physical level. Remember, the one carrying the unforgiveness is also the one enslaved to the bitterness and resentment. Research has also demonstrated that the desire to reciprocate a negative interpersonal behavior with even more negative behavior is deeply ingrained in our human nature. And so when you're hurt by someone, most of us choose to either avoid the issue or seek revenge against the one who has hurt us, which actually perpetuates the cycle. However, research also demonstrates that one way to interpret the cyclical nature of avoidance and revenge is through forgiveness. because the danger of resentment lies not in having it, but rather in being dominated by it to such a degree that one can never overcome it and thus acts irresponsibly on the basis of the need for revenge. You see, just as one could have distress over witnessing the mistreatment of others, which stands as an emotional testimony that we care about them and their rights, so does resentment stand as emotional testimony that we care about ourselves and our rights when we are mistreated. Because it's not enough for me to simply say, I respect myself. Often we feel compelled to also convey this emotionality. And that is typical by showing resentment through a strong negative response focused on the person who has mistreated us. Now, I'm not saying you should or can't feel that way, or that you even have to decide to forgive. But what I am saying is that research has demonstrated that if you don't change your response in some way, unforgiveness can take its toll on your physical, mental, relational, and even spiritual health. Forgiveness frees us from the inner turmoil that comes from harboring grudges, and at other times frees us from our tendency to sometimes have an overly narcissistic involvement with our own injury and see ourselves as more victimized than we really are. Or maybe, given the circumstances, it does both. Forgiveness is a way of not only overcoming or surviving the bitterness and resentment, but it is also a way to truly transcend the impact of the offenses, to come to a place in our lives where we are thriving despite what the other person is doing or has done. So forgiveness properly understood, and practiced with patience increases our well-being and emotional health. However, most people avoid forgiveness. Those who have hurt them, even if they believe that they can or should, because they think or believe that forgiveness means reconciliation. Now, in some circumstances, forgiveness may allow us to include reconciliation as part of the forgiveness process. With others whose relationship is of value, however, it is not. And I reiterate this on the basis of my own personal experience. I am a survivor of extreme domestic violence. And I want there to be no misunderstanding. Reconciliation is not a requirement of forgiveness. And many times reconciliation is not even possible. Look, we all deal with injustices of an offense in many ways. And the choice to forgive is left to each of us. And while some of you may still not be convinced, I want to discuss the toll unforgiveness can have and will have on you physically, mentally, relationally, and even spiritually, and how scientific research supports the health benefits of forgiveness. In most cases of feeling unjustifiably attacked, one feels anger, and that is a normal and healthy feeling. However, prolonged anger can become unhealthy. There have been numerous studies done regarding the relationship between anger and health. And there is scientific evidence regarding the danger of holding on to a deep-seated anger. Increased blood pressure, increased risk of heart disease. There's also research that demonstrates that anger, like other strong emotions, is contagious and can disrupt relationships outside of the relationship the one that has with the offender. In this case, the alienating parent. Dr. Wallerstein was a psychologist, researcher, and foremost authority on the effects of divorce. She founded a 25-year study on the effects of divorce on children. The anger from divorce continued long after the divorce. In session, the co-parents would restate the precise details of the experience that led to the unforgiveness. And they did so in exactly the same way that they did when they had first experienced it, now decades after the event had happened. Neither their recollection of the details nor their pain or the anger had lessened. And this lasting anger prevented the family from moving forward. So I guess you might be asking yourselves, well, now that I understand what forgiveness is and is not now, and what the research says, how can forgiveness take place? First, what if forgiveness wasn't a single act, but rather a process? And furthermore, what if the forgiveness process I was talking about was not about a conditioned response from the alienating parent, but rather, what if the act of forgiveness gave you the freedom to interact with the alienating parent without internalizing their anger? And what if the process could actually help you learn how to remove yourself from the abusive situation? The steps I'm going to cover are from the work of Dr. Enright, who pioneered the science and the scientific study of forgiveness. The process of forgiveness is unique to each person. So as I go through this, please keep in mind that this is a process. It is not necessarily linear, and you are unique. So that means there is no set timetable for how long the process of forgiveness can take. It is not a quick fix, and it is hard, and at times, painful work. The deeper the hurt, the longer it may take to heal. And during the healing process, you may even find that once you have addressed an area, you may have to circle back around later and revisit it. This is similar to the work that's done in the grieving process. And while it's important to understand your motivation and worldview as it pertains to the work of forgiveness, it is okay for you to be open to exploring the process of forgiveness for pure self-preservation. Like, I'm tired of feeling the pain, or I want it to stop. Or even, I don't want to give this person the satisfaction of hurting me anymore. This is a perfectly normal response when the hurt runs deep. With regards to one's worldview, it is developed partially from our family or origin, culture, religious beliefs, and philosophical concepts to which we have been exposed. Some people have rigid constructed worldviews, while others are less well-defined or adhered to. For example, some may believe that forgiveness is important because of their religious beliefs, but at the same time, believe that forgiveness is a sign of weakness. Although it is not necessary to have a well-defined worldview, you may find that your worldview begins to take more structure as you engage in the process of forgiveness. Erik Erikson believed that a consistent worldview was essential if a person was going to accomplish anything of value. So the first step in forgiveness is being willing to examine the anger you have as a result of the unfairness towards you. Are you avoiding it? Are you afraid of it? Is it affecting your health? Are you obsessed about the offense or the alienated parent? Has the emotional injury from the alienation resulted in a permanent change in your life? Has this changed your worldview? Realizing that you are angry can be uncomfortable or even painful, but forgiveness, and I mean real forgiveness, is not about pretending that nothing is happening, nor is it about hiding your pain. It is about acknowledging your pain and respecting what is truly going on for you. The next step is deciding to forgive. See, although your worldview does not have to line up, you do have to make a decision and commit to the process. One thing that can help is to ask yourself if you've been doing is working. Has it? And are you satisfied with the current results? If the answer is no, then ask yourself, what are your options? And is one of those options to begin the process of forgiveness? Making the decision to forgive is good, but you also have to take concrete action to work on forgiveness and make it real. The last step is discovering and releasing your negative emotion. Unforgiveness, bitterness, resentment, and anger, the four walls of the prison of unforgiveness. And unforgiveness is the key forgiveness is the key that opens the door to your freedom. You have to possess that key, turn it, and then you can walk into your freedom. As you walk through the process of forgiveness, you may want to have some tools. So first, it's always easier to do things with others. So consider inviting a close or trusted friend, therapist, or sibling to join you on this journey. See, anger and resentment often trap us in a cycle of negative thinking, self-justification, shame, guilt. Just keep in mind that the person you choose has to be someone who is sensitive to your experiences, but not stuck in their own unforgiveness cycle, or else you will feed off of each other's negativity and there'll be no healing. Second, you should commit to keeping a journal. I know that when I bring up journaling to some of my clients, they have a negative reaction, and perhaps some of you just have the same reaction. But I'll tell you, I'm a big fan of journaling because any change, physical or emotional, happens slowly over time. And journaling helps us to get a visual and concrete record of our growth. When we journal, actually, anytime we physically write something down, we stimulate a very specific area at the base of our brain, known as the RAS. The RAS is responsible for our wakefulness, our ability to focus, and our fight or flight response, as well as how we perceive the world. So basically, it controls what we perceive in our consciousness and is essentially the gatekeeper for information. And according to a brain imaging study conducted in 2017 by UCLA psychologists Lieberman, Eiserberg, Crockett, and their assistants, they demonstrated that writing down thoughts and emotions actually reduces activity in the amygdala, or the emotional center of one's brain, and engages the thinking brain, while actually lowering the intensity of feelings like anxiety, anger, and sadness. Additionally, in 2017, a study by Vandermeer and Vanderweel, they found that writing and drawing, or handwriting activities, activate the largest section of the brain, which actually assists the brain in processing information more effectively. This assists in enabling one to be in a state of readiness to learn how to release any pent-up emotions related to anxiety, depression, anger, and distress. Furthermore, some research from New Zealand demonstrated that, in fact, expressive writing could help one heal faster. The body of research on the mind-body connection is extensive, and we have only been able to begin to scratch the surface. But suffice it to say, that research supports the notion that journaling actually helps one heal. Journaling aids in one's ability to analyze experiences through assessing one's current state of mind. And this helps prepare the mind to be able to learn from experiences. This whole process basically encourages the mind to provide problem solving, which leads one to be able to see growth and a path forward. Some of you may be thinking, okay, that's great, but I hate to journal and I have no idea where to start or really what to do. I understand this. So the next section will be going over what the process of forgiveness utilized in your journal looks like. But before we get started, I need to emphasize again that this is a journey. Results are not instantaneous, nor is it a one and done kind of activity. In fact, what you are going to quickly notice is that this journey of journaling will be having you look at and relook at whatever topic you choose to begin with. This is not about journaling from an autobiographical perspective. It is about journaling to process some very difficult parts of your life experience. Each step in the process has taken a deeper look from a different perspective. So be patient and remember, this is an investment in you and you're worth it. I know that journaling can be challenging. Many of my clients have shared with me their challenges with journaling. Sometimes they don't know where to start, which is where we'll get to in a few minutes. But the biggest challenge that journaling turns up in the experience, the emotion of experience. And I understand this because I'm not only a counselor, but I'm also a journal person. I journal nearly every day. So I want to add this disclaimer. When you are on this journey, you'll need to be sure to check in with yourself and that other trusted confidant you invited on this journey for the purposes of assessing how much anxiety you actually do have, or depression, or anger. This will be your check-in, and the person you brought with you will be your confidant to help make sure that they are a good sounding board and that they're assessing it with you. And if these emotions become too overwhelming for you and for your confidant, please contact a professional to help you work through this. Okay, let's get started. First, you'll need to obtain a journal. This may seem like a simple enough task, and you may think anything will do, but as much time as you're going to spend with this journal, you'll want it to be something that you really like. This journal is going to contain your deepest thoughts, so make it special. One that stands out among your personal things so that you can spot it quickly and not lose it. And whatever it is, whether it's a spiral bound or leather covered or plain, or with a design, a composition, soft covered binding, or perhaps even an electronic writing pad, use something that speaks to you. I happen to use something called Remarkable. And if you don't know what that is, you can search it out on the web later. What I like about it is that you can write on it using a special pencil, and then the writing, so you get the writing experience of writing on paper. And then your writings can be uploaded to your computer, which is my personal favorite, as I found all my journals were beginning to take up a lot of space when they were just in paper bound. Anyways, regardless of what you choose, just select a journal that fits your personality and your lifestyle. Second, set aside some time for this process. Remember, this is about your mental health and your personal growth. So make sure that your personal growth is a priority and commit to a regularly scheduled time to journal. Some of you, like myself, love early mornings, while others of you may prefer a different time of day. Whatever your schedule, you make the time. A time when you can focus and not be interrupted. So for my A-type people in the audience, this means no multitasking while journaling. No trying to watch the news, listen to a podcast, or make dinner while you're trying to journal. Make the time you have allotted a gift that you give yourself every day. Some of you may be asking, how much time should I set aside? And do I have to actually journal every day? Well, let me take this one at a time. First, regarding how much time to set aside, it depends. Now, I acknowledge that this may not be the answer that some of you may have been looking for, but it's the only one that I have because there is an ebb and flow to this process. Let me give you an example. Sometimes when I journal, it takes me 5-10 minutes. And then on other days, I have a lot to analyze and process, and it takes longer. So I give myself at least 30 minutes. I think I just heard some of you say 30 minutes. Where am I going to get 30 minutes? Can I just say that, frankly, if you don't have 30 minutes to give yourself, perhaps that is something you should be journaling about. I mean, really, ask yourself, why are you not making yourself the first priority? Setting aside uninterrupted, quiet time in order to experience growth is so critical to your mental health. It is not selfish. In fact, it's probably the least selfish thing one could do. Remember what a flight attendant says during the pre-flight instructions. What is it they say? Put your mask on first before helping others. Because honestly, if you pass out, fall out, or check out, you are no good to anyone, including yourself. So the second question, every day? Well, Remember, this is not an academic writing assignment. No one will be grading your work. This is an activity for you and by you. So you get to set the rules for how long or short the writing is, whether you use formal language, abbreviations, combinations of both. Be unfiltered in your word choice. If you want, be sure that whatever way you write, you know what you're writing so you can read it when you look it over. How many have said ever, I can't read my own writing? I know I have. Some amount of penmanship might actually be helpful here. But whatever color pen you use, that's up to you. I don't care if you use multiple colors, highlighters, crayons, pens, pencils, whatever you want is fine, because this is about you. The journal is your safe space where you are free to be who you are and say exactly what's on your mind. Even if what's on your mind is socially unacceptable, politically incorrect, offensive, or maybe confusing to even you at first. While I think it's important you don't censor yourself, it is helpful to choose an ambiguous term that most accurately captures your thoughts. For example, you may journal something like, when he said that, it made me mad. Don't leave it there. Journal about exactly what he said that made you angry. Characterize your anger and journal about why his words made you so angry. Another tip is to keep you from losing momentum. As you are writing, try to avoid going back over your notes to correct any grammatical errors. Just be in the moment and write. Maybe some days you fill out a page after page, and on other days you write only 1 or 2 sentences. Please remember, it is up to you. You can write as much or as little as you want or need. Just refrain from becoming academic about it, because if you do, you will miss out on the true reason for writing, which is to gain insight and real understanding and enlightenment about yourself and the circumstances in life that have caused you anxiety, depression, bitterness, or any other negative emotion attached to unforgiveness. And as a side note, journaling for processing feelings works for any feeling. However, for this discussion, we're going to be focused on those attached to unforgiveness. So go ahead and make a standing date with yourself. Commit to this for your growth, your mental health, and your well-being. You give your time to so many other things. So why not give this gift of time to yourself? If we are going to learn and grow, we must be willing to devote some of our time to this process. Fourth, find a comfortable spot where you can journal. In your bedroom, on your porch, or maybe out in your backyard. Just make sure it's a spot that is always accessible. Don't find yourself unable to journal because it's pouring rain and your spot is in the middle of the backyard. Make sure it's a place where you can get comfortable, feel relaxed, and just write. Also, if you live with others, be sure to let them know that you are setting a time aside for yourself and wish not to be disturbed during my me time. And then just start to write. Remember, whatever you write, whatever your pace, it's fine, because there is no right or wrong way to do this. And if you find yourself thinking, I don't know what to write, this is hard, then just write that down. Once your hand starts moving that pen across the paper, more thoughts will come. Like, why is this so hard? Am I so closed up to myself that I can't even express my thoughts? Then you might begin thinking, maybe I am. And then you might think, why am I so closed up to expressing my thoughts? And before you know it, you've journaled some potentially very enlightening material. Now, I know some of you may be thinking about, okay, what am I going to write about? Well, glad you asked. Before I start giving examples of questions you can ask yourself, I want you to give you a framework for this exercise, and I want to let you know that there is no special formula, meaning you don't have to start with any particular starting point. I will give you several ideas and you can choose the one you want, or some other starting point that you choose. Also, you don't have to ask yourself any of the specific questions I present, nor do they have to be in any particular order. The framework for this forgiveness journey is based on the concepts of Socratic thinking. Socrates was an ancient Greek philosopher who believed that one should know themselves and that this could be achieved by asking thought-provoking questions, which stimulates critical thinking in order to draw out ideas and underlying presuppositions, and then challenge them to confirm or disprove their validity. So don't worry if you don't get every specific starting point or question, because I'm merely attempting to give you some examples of Socratic thinking to help you explore yourself. Also, as a side note, this type of analytical thinking works for any situation, not just unforgiveness. However, because unforgiveness is a topic of my discussion, that is the perspective from which I will be speaking. Okay, so first you have to find a focal point. The focal point is the one thing you want to zero in on. Let me use a very benign example to illustrate. The house is dirty and needs to be cleaned, but you look all around and get overwhelmed because every room needs to be cleaned. Furniture needs to be dusted, laundry needs to be done, the kitchen is a disaster. Taking all that in is enough to cause total paralysis. Instead of being overwhelmed, pick one thing that you can focus on. Okay, let's say it's the kitchen. So your present focus is narrowed to just one room. And now you're able to get it all cleaned up and you have a sense of accomplishment. And now you can tackle another room and do the same. But if you don't have a focal point, the tendency is to take on the whole situation, process it all in one sitting, which would be completely overwhelming and cause you to prematurely stop the process. The paralysis is talking about simply because there's just far too much work to work through. So take your time. You don't have to do all of anything in a single sitting. This is not a sprint. This is a marathon. Therefore, it would be better to find a good starting point. And for your first journaling journey, I would recommend starting small. Let's start by picking just one thing you want to analyze. Perhaps it's a person or a single incident or even a pattern of behavior or outcomes you see. So for example, you could start by asking yourself questions like, who hurt me? Now, if this is more than one person, try to stay focused on one person at a time. So you might list all out who hurt me and then pick one person. Remember, you don't want to overwhelm yourself by trying to list out all the hurts by everybody that has ever hurt you. Second, another starting point might be, how do I feel about that person? I mean, if he or she was sitting right next to me, how would I feel? Let's dig deep on this one. Try to really put yourself in that place. And perhaps this is one of those questions that is seemingly easy to answer. You find that it's not so easy. Maybe it takes hours or days to fully answer this question. Or how about let's look at a starting point of how deeply am I hurt? Again, perhaps a more lengthy answer than the question. Take your time. Write as much or as little as you can or want to until you are satisfied that you have answered the question. Remember, and I will say this several more times before we're done, this is a journey. There is not a time limit. There is not a day limit. But remember, rushing through this just to be done is not the object here. The object is healing, and that takes time. Next, choose a situation to focus on. Remember, we know that alienation often starts before the separation or divorce. So can you think about when it first started? Going back to the starting point is important because unforgiveness is like a dandelion. If it is not dug up, out of the roots, it grows back. And unforgiveness is the bloom that grows from the stem, which is resentment, which germinates from the seed, forming the root of the very first deep wound in the relationship. What are the specifics? Because we want to dig the whole root out, try to remember as many of the specifics as possible. For example, what day or time of year was it? Was it morning, noon, night? Were you indoors, outdoors? Was it hot or cold, raining, snowing? Can you remember what you were wearing? How exactly did the person speak to you? Harsh, dismissive, indifferent? Next, is there anything you need to take responsibility for? So be honest. Sometimes it's very hard to think that, hey, this is my fault. None of us are perfect. We are all human and we all make mistakes. But please hear me out on this. As a survivor of domestic abuse, where my former husband, after brutally beating me for 45 minutes, put a loaded semi-automatic pistol to my head and pulled the trigger twice, and praise God, the gun did not fire. I fully and completely understand that I had nothing to do with his behavior. But before I could move on, before I could forgive, I had to do some of my own work. And that meant I had to ask myself, what did I believe about myself that allowed me to believe that I deserved to be in a relationship like that? And I had to take responsibility for staying too long. The benefit of exploring this part of my journey through unforgiveness helped me to weed out those things and identify things that had taken responsibility, things that I had taken responsibility for, that in reality were not actually mine. This freed me from a lot of guilt and shame, which overall helped make me stronger. So as you peel back the layers on this journey, I ask that you take time to notice the patterns within your own emotions or behaviors. What feelings or reactions were the events eliciting for you while they were happening? And even now as you're writing them. For example, I ignored and rationalized my hurt and confusion. What about you? Did the feelings or reactions you felt or feel trigger a memory from a previous experience in your life? Not just with the alienator, but when or if you had feelings or reactions previous like this in your life. These will be other areas of your life that you can explore now or later, or go back and forth. Just follow the thought to the end and then start again with the same place you started until there's nothing left to unpack. And remember, this is a journey, and like most journeys worth taking, there can be long and have twists and turns, but can be exciting and have moments that result in unexpected outcomes. Know that the goal of the journey here is that it ends in a discovery of self. So now that you have identified a specific starting point, let's begin to unpack it. To do that, we'll need to start by identifying the anger that is underlying the act of unforgiveness. This is important because anger keeps us connected to the individual in an unhealthy way. You see, when we allow ourselves to react in anger, what we are really doing is compromising ourselves by handing over our emotions to the one who's hurting us. When we do this, it can result in shame or guilt, as we later regret that we lowered our own standards by the actions we took in that moment of anger. So, as we begin this journey in exploring anger, we're going to start with identifying whether you've been using any defense mechanisms. That is important to assess because defense mechanisms can actually hurt you by preventing you from confronting injustices, as well as your anger. When I am in a session with co-parents and we are discussing how not to react in anger, I usually ask them, where in your body do you first feel angry? Then we talk through a simple body scanning exercise where I discuss with them the more common areas and ways people feel anger in their body. This is done to assist them in identifying where in their bodies they first feel it. And as a side note, sometimes they feel it in more than one place, and that's okay. We're going to do something similar here by asking the question, how have you avoided dealing with your anger? And then by doing an intellectual scan to identify how. So I want you to think about the question, how have I avoided dealing with my anger? And while you're thinking about that, I'm going to briefly discuss some of the more prevalent defense mechanisms that people use. As I do, I want you to think about the following questions you might ask yourself when you're journaling so that you can note the different types of defense mechanisms you might be using. Have I been using defense mechanisms in an attempt to distance myself from the anger, hurt, or anxiety? How am I currently using a defense mechanism to prevent myself from confronting injustice? And if so, why? Does the use of this defense mechanism actually hurt me? And in what ways has the defense mechanism actually gotten in the way of my healing? And lastly, am I hurting others through my anger or use of a defense mechanism? So the first type of defense mechanism we will be talking about is denial. Denial is actually the best known of all defense mechanisms. It is often used in situations when an individual feels unable or powerless to face reality or admit an obvious truth because the truth is too difficult and they don't have the coping skills. Denial can involve either a flat-out rejection of the existence of a fact or reality, or perhaps one might actually recognize that something is true, but they minimize the importance of the incident. Furthermore, sometimes people will accept the reality and the seriousness of the fact, but they will deny their own responsibility and instead blame others for or outside forces for what's happened. Next, let's look at repression. Repression is the unconscious blocking of an unwanted or unpleasant thought, emotion, impulse, or memory from the conscious mind to avoid confronting these difficult experiences. However, while initially it might be effective at calming someone down, with continued use, what actually happens is that over time, it actually increases one's anxiety. Repression is often confused with another type of defense mechanism called suppression. Now, the difference between the two is repression involves unconsciously blocking unwanted thoughts or impulses, whereas suppression is the conscious and purposeful blocking of painfully intrusive thoughts. However, research demonstrates that the more you try to forget something, the more you actually think about it. Additionally, this takes a lot of mental energy to suppress something. So if one is tired, distracted, stressed, or something else, whatever memory they're actually trying to keep at bay may seem to start to overwhelm them faster and faster. Another defense mechanism is displacement. This is when you unconsciously substitute an object of the original anxiety provoking anger to a target or an object that is less harmful or threatening, resulting in the individual being able to release their negative emotions on that thing. And like every defense mechanism we have briefly discussed this far, it may seem like, oh, it works initially, but in the long run, it causes more challenges than it fixes. Interjection or identification with the aggressor. This is when you internalize an idea or the voice of the other people. What this means is it is essentially you imitate the behaviors of the abuser. This is the defense mechanism that helps us to explain Stockholm Syndrome. For illustration purposes, I'm going to use an example of what a couple initial journals may look like. So the topic I have chosen was who hurt me. And this is a snippet of some of my own journaling. We dated for 5 years, and we had heated arguments in the relationship early on, seemingly insignificant issues. He was always verbally aggressive and in his anger, but he was never physically abusive. These arguments were confusing and they left me feeling unhappy and discouraged. But I either ignored or rationalized all of them. I was in denial. Another snippet of a journal entry from this time for me was, he was extremely sarcastic, and most of the time I couldn't discern if he was serious or kidding. All I knew it was hurtful. Again, I ignored this behavior. I was using the denial defense mechanism. The night of our wedding rehearsal, I was 45 minutes late. I had a vehicle that was 15 years old with over 170,000 miles. I had no reverse, no neutral, and it didn't go over 35 miles an hour. And it was extremely difficult to start sometimes. He called me when he got to the hotel where we were going to have our wedding rehearsal. And I told him that my car was having difficulties. And since he had a rental car, I asked if he could come and get me. He told me that the flight was long and that he was too tired to drive the 5 miles. I ignored this behavior. I was in denial. When I finally got to the hotel 45 minutes later, a fight ensued, and it resulted in him backing me into a corner and slapping me across the face. I rationalized this behavior. He was tired. He didn't punch me, and it was the night before our wedding. About 2 months later, we were having a discussion about a house we were building. We got into a fight, and he shook me and pushed me to the ground. I rationalized this behavior. He had recently been deployed, and he was very stressed. The fights escalated, and by the time we were married for 9 months, I found myself sitting on the edge of our bed after a 45-minute beating with a loaded gun to my head. Again, I was not responsible in any way for his behavior, only my own. To heal from what he did and to forgive meant I had to go on my own journey, which led me back to my childhood and forward to my future. That season of my life was nearly 30 years ago, and I can honestly say I have forgiven him. But, and I think this is important, we never reconciled. I have no desire to reconcile. And remember, reconciliation does not equal forgiveness. And reconciliation is not a requirement in the forgiveness process. Okay, so those are the 5 most common defense mechanisms and how they came into play in my own life. So when you go through, I want you to see how they come into play in your life. Next, we will be exploring if you have faced your anger. Once you acknowledge your anger, you need to evaluate it rationally. This is a good place to remind you to consult with that trusted confidant you invited on this journey, because this part can be really intense. So go back and look at your initial journal entry about entry that now has the defense mechanism identified. And let's explore your anger. First, how would you describe your anger right now toward the individual or the incident upon which you're focused on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being not angry at all and 10 being the most angry anyone could be? Assess where you are. You should repeat this evaluation throughout your journey so you can see how your anger subsides as you process through this journey. Next, take some time to sit with your anger and journal all the feelings that are arising. How does your anger make you feel anxious or afraid? Are there some words that continue to pop up as you're journaling? Is your anger childish, or are your reactions immature? How long have you been angry or resentful regarding this particular matter or person? Has your anger deepened or decreased over time? Have you ever felt this anger or type of anger before? If so, with who or what was the cause of your anger? As a side note, if you listed many people and multiple causes for anger, just hold on to that list and refocus on the one person or incident uh, that you are initially identified. But once you're finished the process with that person or incident, you can return to this list of people or incidents and restart the process of forgiveness. Sometimes people avoid exploring their anger because they're afraid of it. But when you're wronged and you have a right to feel angry, and directed anger can be healthy as it motivates us to do things like stand up in the face of adversity or right or wrong. Anger only becomes a problem when it is undirected and allowed to infest us and every thought we have. And as it settles in, so does resentment, which spurs the desire to seek revenge instead of justice. Or the anger settles in and creates fear or helplessness, resulting in our falling into denial, suppression, or repression. Once you have explored your anger, write in your journal a letter, as if you were writing to the person who is the focus of your anger. Let them know why you're angry, how angry you are, what you're angry about, the injustice, the struggles you've endured because of their unfairness. Remember, do not censor this. Just write about the raw, unfiltered anger you have. If you feel that your anger is controlling you or your resentment is taking control of you, discuss this in your journal and with that trusted confidant you've invited on this journey. Some of you may be thinking, this is a lot of work, or you might be feeling exhausted just thinking about this. So let's pause here for a moment. I want you to close your eyes and I want you to think about how anger has complicated your life. Just stay focused. How has all that anger made things so much more complicated? Now, with your eyes still closed, I want you to take a deep breath. Take a slow, deep breath, filling up your lower belly like a balloon, and hold it. And just let it go, nice and slow. Take another deep breath from your lower belly and hold it. Now let it go. And I want you to take one more deep breath. Hold it and let it go. Now I want you to think about what it would be like to be free from all that anger. Are you lighter, happier, less stressed? Okay, open your eyes. I hope that you are calmer now and motivated to continue. A lot of time when a person gets into this part of the journey, they are confronted with the depth of their anger and they begin to feel shame and guilt because of their victimization. Shame is the fear of what we think others will think if they knew what had happened. I know and I understand the depth of which shame can paralyze a person. When I was going through the victimization of domestic violence, I felt shame because, you see, I was an officer in the United States Army, and I was afraid that if my chain of command knew the truth about what was going on, I was concerned that they would think if I wasn't capable of making good decisions for my own personal safety, how could I make good decisions regarding the care of the soldiers that were entrusted to me? So go back to your journal. And staying with the same person and incident, let's consider the aspect of shame. Do you have shame? Are you ashamed? If so, write about it and explore the cause of the shame. What you think other people think, would think, or what you think they are saying or thinking about you. How are you responding to the real or imagined judgmental actions of others? Now, rate the shame the same as you did the anger, with 1 being no shame at all and 10 being an extreme amount of shame. Write about your shame. And then This is a big step. Give someone the opportunity to reflect back to you that you are worthy, valuable, and lovable through sharing your story, either with your trusted confidant that you initially invited on this journey, or if that person is not available and you would feel more comfortable sharing it with a professional, then do so. And please allow and accept the other person's edification of you. Guilt, on the other hand, is how we feel about ourselves when we realize that we have violated our own standards of right and wrong. One thing that is important as one explores this feeling is to distinguish between real guilt and false guilt. Real guilt makes us angry, whereas false guilt is often a reaction to anger towards someone we need or love. So on the one hand, you are hurt and angry when a person you love hurts you, but you are also afraid that your anger will provoke additional injury. This often results in anger being turned in on oneself. So please hear me. I am not saying you should or that you have to feel guilt, but some may feel this way. And in fact, many survivors of abuse and violence often do feel this way. And this exercise provides a way to investigate this emotion. So let's go back to your journal and unpack this next layer by asking yourself these questions. Do you believe you are guilty of some wrongdoing towards the person who hurt you or somehow contributed to this event? Explore this through writing down instances in which you may have acted unfairly to the person that is the focus of your journey. Or write down the instances in which you believe you may have acted unfairly in the circumstances of the incident that is the focus of your journey. Don't analyze this yet. We'll do that next, but for now, just write. Now go back and analyze this list and ask yourself if that, in fact, was in fact an unfair response or a reasonable response given the circumstances. And if you come across a circumstance where you truly don't have a defense for your behavior, just acknowledge it. We're going to start to wrap this discussion up the same way we started, talking about anger. Anger is toxic, not just to one's psychological well-being, but also to one's physical well-being. Research has shown that there is a bidirectional relationship between one's mental and physical health. This means that if one's mental health is poor, they're at a higher risk for chronic physical ailments and vice versa. So if you're struggling with high levels of anger, you are putting yourself at risk for long-term physical consequences, such as increased anxiety, high blood pressure, headaches. In fact, did you know that in the 2 hours after an angry outburst, the chances of having a heart attack doubles? Or repressing your anger puts you in a high-risk category for heart disease? And if instead of repressing, you are prone to lashing out, well, you are at 3 times higher risk of having a stroke from a blood clot or a brain to the brain or bleeding within the brain within 2 hours after an angry outburst. Not to mention, if you're mad all the time, your immune system suffers. In fact, a study out of Harvard found that when healthy people simply recall an angry experience from their past, doing so causes a 6-hour dip in levels of antibody immunology. This is the first line of defense in your cells against infection. Another Harvard study indicated that an uptick in stress hormones associated with anger creates inflammation in the airways, which increases the risk of respiratory problems. And I think the most startling research on anger is a 17-year study from the University of Michigan, which indicated that holding on to anger shortens one's lifespan as compared to individuals who are willing to acknowledge their anger and let it go. Given the significantly negative consequences of anger, it's important that you examine how much anger is attached to your unforgiveness. So let's pull back one more layer of unforgiveness. as you reflect on how much you focus on anger. To get the most accurate picture, try keeping the journal for a whole day about the following. How much of your energy is devoted to defense mechanisms or negative thinking? How much energy is devoted to stewing over the situation or the person that is the focus of your unforgiveness? For example, how many times during the day were you involved in an activity and thought about the person or incident in a negative way? What are your automatic reactions or your thoughts? Anger, aggression, bitterness, frustration? And how much of your day is left over for loving those who support and appreciate you? For doing the things you enjoy. So what do you do with the pain? We have seen that we can't deny it or expect it to just go away. We have also seen that pain has a terrible way of growing and multiplying, not just within ourselves, but being passed down generation to generation. The alienator did not just invent their behavior. This withholding of love, holding grudges, and revenge are all learned behaviors that were passed down to them. And although these behaviors may not have manifested in their lives as alienation, there was a framework somewhere in their lives that was laid for the manifestation of these negative behaviors that was built on from a previous generation. I do not say this to excuse their behavior, but to explain and to ponder what's happening for the next generation. For the past several years, I have accepted invitations to our local high school to give a presentation on domestic violence and teenage dating violence. And I shared the testimony about my lived experiences so that the next generation will have an awareness and tools to come against domestic violence. One interesting point of this is that I'm often asked if I had my abuser prosecuted. And the answer is no. Because he was so full of hate and anger, I didn't want to expose myself to any further toxicity from his behavior. Because it would have just ended up dragging me down into a place I didn't want to be. He didn't want or need my forgiveness, but I needed to forgive so that I didn't have to remain in a place where he could continue to steal my happiness and my peace. And by making this decision to just let go and break away, I severed the possibility that I would be passing on that next generation of negativity to my daughter. Here's what Dr. Frankl said about this. Psychotherapist Viktor Frankl was a victim of the Nazis and experienced trauma of the Holocaust firsthand. From his experiences and training, he developed the theory logotherapy, which literally means therapy through meaning. Frankl's approach to psychotherapy confronts the problem of suffering. He believed that mankind is motivated by a will to meaning, which corresponds to a desire to seek and make meaning out of one's life, even in the midst of the most distressing moments of their life. Now, this is not to say that people should accept injustice. Rather, Frankl's philosophy was that the past cannot be changed, but we can take and should take action to reduce or eliminate injustices. So let's take the next step on our journey, our journal journey, by asking ourselves, what have you learned from this unjust experience? Has it made you a stronger person, more moral, sensitive, mature, courageous? Can or do others somehow gain because of what you've endured and how you've matured? What actions can you take to eliminate the negativity from affecting the next generation? Take some time to contemplate your purpose. Then consider how the purpose of your life can be expanded based on what you have learned about yourself through this experience. Once you've worked your way through these steps, go back and review your journal. See if there's any areas you could add information. Because remember, this journey This is a journey. And once you work your way through the most difficult parts, you may discover some underlying feelings and thoughts that were masked by more prominent thoughts and feelings. While you're reviewing your journal, be sure to assess your initial ratings. Note the changes and congratulate yourself for the hard work that you've done. As we wrap up, remember that freedom from pain of someone else's choices and actions means that one must courageously confront their anger, identify the offender's bad behavior, humbly accept that someone has hurt us deeply, and work on changing our thoughts, feelings, and behavior towards that person who doesn't deserve any of it. As I was preparing for this discussion tonight, I was reminded of the writings of David Whyte, a British philosopher and poet, regarding forgiveness. Forgiveness is a heartache and difficult to achieve because, strangely, it is not only refusing to eliminate the original wound, but actually draws us closer to its source. To approach forgiveness is to close in on the nature of the hurt itself, the only remedy being, as we approach this raw center, to reimagine our relation to it. It never arises from the part of us that was actually wounded. The wounded self may be the part of us incapable of forgetting and perhaps not actually meant to forget. As if, like the foundational dynamics of a philosophical immune system or a psychological defense mechanism, must remember and organize against any further attacks. All the identity of the one who must forgive is actually founded on the very fact of having been wounded. Still stranger, it is the wound branded unforgotten part of us that eventually makes forgiveness an act of compassion rather than one of simply forgetting. To forgive is to assume a larger identity than the person who was first hurt, to mature, to bring to fruition an identity that can put all its arms not only around the affected one within, but also around the memories seared within us by the original blow, and through a kind of psychological virtuosity, extend our understanding to one who first delivered it. Forgiveness is a skill, a way of preserving clarity, sanity, and generosity in an individual's life. A beautiful way of shaping the mind to a future we want ourselves. As I close, remember, just because the scientific community has brought their influence to validate what religious leaders were preaching for centuries does not mean that forgiveness is now somehow disconnected from religion. For centuries, forgiveness has been associated with major religions because they include teachings on the nature of forgiveness, and many individuals draw upon their faith when forgiving. Therefore, a comprehensive understanding of forgiveness can only be obtained by taking into account religious perspectives, and it is this understanding that has provided the underlying framework for scientific research and understanding forgiveness, and for the development of therapeutic interventions. Thank you for joining us tonight, and I'll see you next time.